Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad that we finally were able to get this technology working for us. I've used these before in the past, but the technology has changed since the last time I was able to do some home recordings. So anyway, we'll just pick up where we're at, and hopefully we can. This will continue right on through the rest of the semester. Um, but the chapter we have on chapter 4 on socialization. Obviously, I'm not going to spend the whole time on the whole chapter. I think that otherwise, if you send an email and wanted me to give you some more explanations of some of these uh, single concepts, especially, I'll be more than happy to give you further detailed explanation. But there's several areas, especially one area in this chapter that I think that students sometimes find to be quite abstract and a little harder to understand. So I want to go over that area for the time we have. But just skip over and just to get us to that point. The chapter starts out talking about socialization and what socialization is, and you can think of socialization as simply the process through which we learn our culture. The last chapter stated that culture is not a genetic given; it's a learned process, and we start learning at birth, and it goes on until death. And so the socialization process begins at birth and continues until the end of life. But socialization is how we learn our culture, and the end point or the success of socialization is found in the concept of internalization. That is, when we internalize the message, or, for example, a political discourse, that we become convinced that it's correct, then we may internalize that and say, "Hey, I believe in that political party's standpoint. Now that's a part of my values, a part of my beliefs." So when internalization works, that means we take into ourselves and we make it personal. We personalize what was given to us from the outside. So whatever the message is, let's say you're thinking about joining a certain church denomination, and you're getting information about their various standpoints, and finally one seems to click with you, then you internalize that. That means it becomes part of your personality, a part of your identity. You identify with that party, for example. Another interesting aspect of internalization, point to be made, is that socialization is not always 100% successful. If socialization was 100% successful, then we would be basically like robots. We would be just simply doing whatever society asks of us, like puppets on a string. But as sociology makes clear that human beings are not 100% predictable, we can only use probability statistics. What's the probability that a child born in a inner city area where there's a lot of gangs, for example, what's the probability that that child will become a gang member? It may be a high probability, but it won't be 100%. So this is the same thing with socialization. It's not always 100% successful, and it's a good thing that it's not. And this will bring up a later chapter on deviance, how we deviate from expectations. But that's for another chapter. This chapter also talks about the nature-nurture debate. There's been ongoing debate in the social sciences between whether human behavior is genetically programmed or is it a product of socialization. And now we've come to a sort of an agreement that nature or genetics sets up the genetic potential to learn culture. And then from there on, it's simply socialization, what we learn. You take the old saying that you can take an infant and place it in a certain culture, and it will grow up to speak that language and those values and those norms and beliefs. But they have to have the genetic potential to be able to learn culture. And then they also, a very traditional area in sociology or example, the use of the case of extreme isolation, looking at children that have been raised in extreme isolation from human contact, and once found how they're limited in their ability to communicate, and even things like their physical ability to stand or to communicate nonverbally. So these are important, and it's an important point in sociology to show that once kids are found out, for example, that have lacked this type of human contact, that through an intense form of socialization, that it's possible to bring them back along, as you read in the case studies here. And that then brings us to, they also talk about individual and collective memory, and how the past traditions, norms, and values and beliefs are passed on from one generation to the next through collective memory. How does a nation pass on its heritages and its history? Is through collective memory. When the people remember an event that happened, and it goes on through several generations, like World War II, 9/11. So that's going to bring me to where I wanted to spend a little bit of time, and that's on the process of the development of self. Psychology has quite a few different theories about the development of the self, whereas sociology has a few ideas, and our main theories comes from the larger theoretical school of symbolic interactionism. And I think once you understand the orientation is, you see that the orientation is much more sociological, or that we give more weight to the society in, if you will, than we do to the individual. And so we have, and I teach this semester, I've been teaching it for quite some time, sociological social psychology, which is sociology's sort of answer to the relationship between the individual and society. Psychology has its own social psychology with its own theories, and sociology has its own social psychology. And but we give more emphasis to the social arena in sociology. So that brings me to George Herbert Mead, one of the early founders of the symbolic interactionist perspective, developed a theoretical model, if you will. I think I may have said earlier that many times sociology concepts come in twos and pairs, threes, and as a small theoretical model. And this is one of the this is a very good example of that. But Mead developed a theory of self-development that they talk about halfway through the chapter, and sometimes students find this to be quite abstract. But he starts with this notion of the I and the me and role-taking. Mead borrowed, actually, somewhat from the psychological tradition, or psychological tradition, especially Freudism. And in Freud, he had the superego, the ego, and the id. And Mead somewhat borrowed from Freud in terms of the superego. But the I and the me for Mead is an internal state of thinking. It's not an external. It's almost subconscious to us most of the time, the I and the me. But the I for Mead is that very spontaneous, childlike, expressive part of ourselves that's sort of a knee-jerk reaction aspect of our behavior. Like if somebody attempts to take a swing at you, you automatically duck, or maybe you take a swing back, and it's almost sort of a knee-jerk reaction. That's the I for Mead. It lacks social control from society, if you will. It's that free, in a positive sense, it's a creative force within us. On the negative side, it has to do with our ability to deviate. So Mead says that the me side of our internal selves, that there's these two voices that are in our heads that struggle with each other. The me for Mead is the socialization of the individual into society's norms and beliefs, but especially the normative side. So, just sort of a philosophical underpinning, the notion here is that it takes society socialization to civilize human beings. That human beings have this sort of wild, creative, uncontrolled reactionary self, the I, and that in order to have civilization, we have to have the me in place that puts a brake on the I. Something in order. It's very akin to Freud's struggle between the id and the superego. Uh, but Mead theorized much more about the me side than he did the I side. So the I side is somewhat taken for granted theoretically. Um, but Mead says that through socialization to internalization, we internalize the do's and don'ts of our society. And sometimes in our minds, if you think about it, a lot of times those, you shouldn't have done that, you shouldn't do this, that was wrong to do. For me, many times that's the me talking to the I. So say, for example, you're in a class, you get a bad grade on your exam, and you look at the professor, and all of a sudden there's this maybe a surge of anger, and you want to curse at the professor or throw a book or some knee-jerk reaction. I hate this class, and I hate you, and I'm going to drop this class, or or throw a book at the professor. What puts a brake on those feelings? And me would say that it's the me. The me, and a lot of times this happens automatically, but the me is there to say, no, don't do that. How many times have we been in this situation where we think about it for a second, we decide, no, I better not do that because I'm going to get in trouble. I might get thrown, I'll flunk the course, or I'll get thrown out of the university for this kind of behavior. So the me puts a brake on a lot of times on those. It's that do's and don'ts in our mind that tells you don't do that. Stop, think about what you're doing. But he sees it as very important because sociologically, the me then is sort of the internalization, but what we're going to talk about in a second, the generalized other. And the generalized other is the internalization of your society's or your community's notion of right and wrong and how things should be done. And once you've internalized the generalized other, then it makes it possible for the person to be able to interact in a quote unquote normal fashion in the society. Without the development of the generalized other, then we would have problems, and this is it falls into where criminologists talking about social control theory, that people don't have enough self-control, and they end up in prison because they can't handle themselves in civilized society, if you will. It's a very important notion sociologically. The next concept by Mead is role-taking, and role-taking, Mead wanted to express the sociological notion that we learn from others, or we reflect on our behavior by taking the role of others. For children, but also for adults, is taking usually the role of significant others in our environment. And by taking the role of others, it makes it possible for us to step out of our selfish standpoint, put the old saying, stand in the shoes of someone else, to see to look back at yourself from the viewpoint of someone else. And in gaining that empathy, then it makes it possible to interact with that status or that person through role taking. It makes us take on, in many ways, role taking is that area where the individual really rubs up against the society or the social normative order, if you will. It's being able to take the position of the other and then look back on ourselves. But we can build on this theoretical notion by looking at Mead's 3 stages of self-development. Mead says that he's thinking here along the lines of childhood socialization, that children go through 3 stages of development in terms of the complexity of role taking, starting from very simple role taking, just to mimicking people's roles, to very complex role taking, such as in the third stage, the game stage. I think it's important to remember that what he's talking about generally is just basically sort of metaphors for what he's really getting at, but he's using simplistic examples to talk about what is really a very complex process. So he talks about the very young child from, infancy on up to about the, and this in terms of years, how old a child is varies a little here. Some children are mature faster than others. But he talks first about the preparatory stage. So in the preparatory stage, the first stage, to about 3 years old, Mead says that the child is simply preparing to role take. They don't really have the brain development to be able to role take in a very complex fashion. But at least at this age, they're beginning to play out in a way, and not even playing out, but just mimicking, sort of like a parrot, speaking a language. They're just repeating what they've seen going on around them. So in the preparatory stage, then the child is just playing. So just to be gender stereotypical, the little boy sits on the couch and watches his dad reading the newspaper, and so he picks one up and does the same. Or the mother in the kitchen is cooking, and she gives the little girl pots and spoons and utensils, and she's mixing the cake batter, and she's watching mother doing that. Well, what's important here is that she's beginning to mimic what are important social roles or statuses later in life. She's stepping out of beginning to step away from their own perspective and mimicking or playing at taking the role of the other. And I think even your PowerPoint is, I have to admit that the PowerPoints I find to be somewhat simplistic for this text, but I think they do touch base with this. They have a few pictures of children in the preparatory stage, so check that out. But this is the first stage. Now the play stage in role taking, again, we're moving from simplistic role taking up to more complex. But in the play stage, this is usually that stage, between 3 and 10 years old, 11 years old. It really varies. But Mead says in the play stage, youngsters are beginning to actually take on the roles of others. Usually, you'll see the concept in the chapter, significant others. These are people or characters. They can even be media characters, on television or in movies that are very important in the child's life. So this could be mother, father. It could be surrogate parents, brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, Power Rangers, Ninja Turtles. Significant others in their lives, and they begin to role take. And usually with the play stages, that the play is spontaneous still. The children aren't rule bound. You can just remember back to your own childhood, going out and playing, having a good time. You play from morning till dusk, and then come home. There's no rules where to do it, where the play is, or any rules about how to do this, to do the play. It's just usually simple, generally two-way roles that kids play out, such as cop and robbers, and playing war, doctor, nurse, all this kind of patient, these kind of simplistic roles. But what is important is at this point the child is stepping outside of their own selfish viewpoint. They're actually playing at a significant social role in society. You have to, the next chapter we go into this even further when we start talking about social statuses and social roles, but we'll lay off of that for now. But just think about it as the children are taking on these simple, usually dualistic, good and bad, cops and robber kinds of role play, if you will, and role take. Let me kind of give you a good example of this. So the little, and again, gender is stereotypical. The little girl is playing with her doll, and the little girl is role taking. She's taking the role of her mother, and the little girl reacts to or interacts with the doll in the way that mother reacts or interacts with her. So what she's learned from observing mother, now she's doing the same. She's role taking. She's playing the mother role towards her doll. I think that's a very clear example of this particular stage of child development. Now, in the last stage of development, the game stage, Mead says it's at this point that the child potentially becomes a full functioning social self, right? The social self is not developed at birth. We don't want to get into arguments whether the child is human but one thing we can say at birth, or before birth, whether they're human or not, that's a different argument altogether. But when we're talking about the social self, we know that an infant's born from a sociological standpoint a blank slate, and society has to inscribe through its socialization onto that individual to take on certain identities and normative patterns of behavior. So with the game stage, then, Mead says this is the full functioning social self. Once a person successfully goes through the game stage, they should be able then to go out in society and interact in any way with successfully with others throughout the society, not just in their home environment, but anywhere for the most part. So Mead says at the game stage that the games are that he uses the example of games that kids play. So if you remember, this is about 12 years old, 10 to 12 years old, somewhere in there, and maybe a little later than that. The kids begin to internalize the game stage in terms of the rules and regulations that it takes to participate in an organized, Little League baseball team. And it is at this stage that the young child or the growing youngster is internalizing the generalized other. So let's just take the Little League baseball team, or there's another kind that comes right before Little League. What is that? But anyway, the coach walks up puts the kids all in their respective positions on the field, walks up, it's T-ball, puts the ball on the tee, hits the ball out in the outfield, and what generally happens is all the kids just go running wild, leaving their positions and chasing after the ball. And of course the coaches having to pull their hair out and say, no, come back. And they place all the kids again. And they have to learn, they're teaching them, you're on the first base, this is your rotating, right? You've got to internalize what it is to be a first baseman and the norms of being in that position, what you're supposed to be doing. But also you've got to relate that or organize that with all the other positions on the team. So in order to be successful as a first baseman, you got to be able to rotate with the pitcher, the catcher, second, third baseman, the outfielders. Everybody has to internalize the community of expectations for all the positions, not just yours. And in that way, then you're doing something that only human beings can do. We haven't found any other species that can do anything near the complexity of role-taking that human beings can do. But once we internalize the generalized other, if you move away from the game and think about going to school, at work, you have to internalize your status with all the other statuses, and let's say in your work field. You have to know what's expected of everybody, because your behavior or your tasks are all tied in with the other tasks that are going on. So that if a ball is hit into the outfield, if everybody's playing their role correctly, then you may be able to get a three-way out, and it may run very smoothly, seem very naturally, but really it's a very complex task of internalizing this complex web of team expectations, if you will. So with the generalized other, it's internalizing all the norms and values of society such that it makes it possible for you to venture out into any social context for the most part, not all, as we'll see, but in most the social arenas, and be able to competently interact with others without having too much problems. And the next chapter is going to make this even more clear, I think, to you when we look at statuses. But let me just give you one last example for the generalized other that I think can help hit this home for you, because again, it can be kind of abstract. So let's take another example. Let's say that when you're a child growing up, let's say in the preparatory stage, early play stage, you spill milk on the floor at home, on the kitchen floor, your mother gets angry with you, right? And so she may scold you, don't do that. You don't spill milk on the floor. So at first the child will begin to think that, when I spill milk on the floor, then it makes mom upset. She gets angry, right? And of course they may do it on purpose for a long time just to make you angry. But and of course this can happen later in life as well. But anyway, as the child gets older, then they go off to school, and then when they spill milk on the floor in the lunchroom, the teacher scolds them about don't pour milk on the floor. Then they're beginning to see that, hey, it's not just mom, but it's also here at the school. The teacher doesn't like it. And then for Mead, once you get to the you're 12, 13, 14 years old, you've internalized the generalized other, then you know that it's not just a norm that mom has, it's a norm of the whole society in which you live, for the most part, that no matter where you go, in a classroom, in school, for example, you don't take if you have milk at that point, most kids aren't drinking milk, but these energy drinks, but you don't take it and pour it out on the floor in front of your professor. You could, but there's going to be consequences, and that's where the me comes in, right? So the me is very much tied into this ability to put a brake on our behaviors socially, so that society can get its work done. Very, very. This is kind of very much from a functional standpoint. This notion of the normative order, and in order for society to survive, and that we're not out raping and pillaging and killing each other, is because of the me. Society's norms put a brake on the normally socialized, or completely, not completely, but the competently socialized individual will use the me, or will pay attention to the me, to put a brake on what might be disruptive behavior throughout. Of course, saying that, you're still going to have people deviating all the time, which again is what makes us free in the end anyway, from a sociological, standpoint. So we'll pick up more on this theme. It'll run right on through the next chapter, as you'll see. But go ahead and study this chapter, and I hope that this little lecturette here has helped you with at least getting some grasp on Mead's theory of self-development. It's a very interesting theory. It may seem simplistic, but when you think about the underpinnings of the logic of the theory, it makes a lot of sense in terms of thinking about children and their maturation, and how society is kept together in a normative fashion. So anyway, I'll see you guys next time, and I'm almost at 30 minutes, so let's cut it. And if you have any questions, send me an email. If I get enough questions on certain concepts and getting used to using this technology, I certainly don't mind putting some more of these up to help you clarify concepts I think that some of you are having problems with. But I think this is a great tool to at least to be able to see who I am, and be able to speak with you as I would in the classroom. So this is how it goes. Have a great weekend. See you guys.